On September 14, 1940, 3:04 in the morning, in the town of Altavilla in South Italy. The air was thick with the scent of shattered olive oil, its mingling with the sulfur of burnt smokeless powder. Sunlight pierced through the artillery-shredded roof of a battered two-story warehouse, illuminating the interior gloom. Behind a second-story window sill 12 meters up, a 21-year-old soldier was gasping for air with bloodshot eyes. His hands were locked in a death grip around the Browning automatic rifle that had carved his path through corpses. At this exact moment, that lethal piece of machinery was nothing more than a useless club because the bolt was seized. The metal was warped from catastrophic overheating, and it refused to budge despite his desperate attempts to fix it. The blistering barrel radiated waves of heat that distorted the air and could peel skin right off his bare palms. This was the squad primary base of fire, and it had just suffered its second failure in a grueling 6-hour span. His ammunition was completely exhausted, and the floor was carpeted in gleaming brass casings that crunched loudly. Frantic radio calls for reinforcements had vanished into the ether, leaving the young American entirely alone. And right outside 40 yards away, the sharp barks of German commands and the crunch of jackboots were closing in. A full company of elite German infantry was forming a Titus, all twedge preparing to overrun this building. The icy blade of the Grim Reaper was practically resting against the back of this young soldier's neck now. Yet staring into this abyss of absolute despair, this former street gang kid from Pittsburgh did not surrender. Instead, a flash of pure reckless madness ignited in his eyes as he shoved aside the useless chunk of iron. He spun around like a cornered beast and began frantically prying open a stack of wooden crates in the corner. His grease-stained, soot-covered hands plunged into the packing straw and pulled out a heavy metallic cylinder. It was an M49A to 60mm high explosive mortar shell weighing nearly 3 pounds. In every infantry manual ever printed, this munition was designed to be dropped down the muzzle of a steel tube. Its fuse was notoriously sensitive, and no military instructor would ever teach a soldier to manually handle it. But this desperate American soldier did something that would make conventional tacticians freeze in horror. Using sheer brute force, his trembling hands ripped the safety pin straight out of the mortar shell nose. In that split second, the weapon became living. If the nose struck any hard surface, it would detonate. He took a deep breath and stepped up to the window like a baseball pitcher in the bottom of the 9th inning. Using raw physical strength, he hurled this unstable, lethal explosive straight down into the German ranks. Over the agonizing hours that followed, this lone soldier unleashed a storm of slaughter so savage and primitive. He broke every single rule the army had ever written, yet he forged an unrepeatable legend of war. To understand how a man could turn his hands into artillery, we look back at the forge that created him. His name was Charles E. Kelly, born on September 23, 1920, in the smog-choked city of Pittsburgh. Growing up during the Great Depression, Kelly lived in a brutal dog-eat-dog neighborhood with industrial smoke. In those dark alleys, the law was an illusion and the real rules were dictated by bare knuckles and brass knuckles. Poverty forced him out of school early, and the ruthless survival games of the streets taught him valuable lessons. He ran with street gangs, learning how to brawl and how to survive when the odds worst act against him. Above all, he carried the harsh wisdom of his father: if you cannot win a fair fight, win by any means necessary. He was a disciplinary black hole who openly mocked what the veterans called window dressing and garrison rituals. While other recruits spent hours using toothbrushes to scrub equipment, Kelly flatly refused to participate. Instructors labeled him a disciplinary failure who would get himself and his squad killed in 5 minutes. His fellow recruits shunned him, saddling him with harsh nicknames, but Kelly possessed one terrifying talent. He was a savant with a rifle, and on the firing range, his street-hardened reflexes transformed him completely. On the firing range, his street-hardened reflexes transformed him, as he did not just shoot at targets but executed. His shot groupings were impossibly tight, and his follow-up shots were delivered with lightning speed to every mark. The instructors recognized a born killer when they saw one and understood the Army needed lethal weapons now. They realized that the Army needed lethal weapons more than it needed polished boots, and kept him in the ranks. They assigned him to Company L of the 143rd Infantry Regiment of the legendary division. This unit was part of the 36th Infantry Division, famously known to all the men as the Texas Division. Even there, his reputation as a Pittsburgh gangster followed him, as he remained a problem soldier for leaders. He only obeyed orders that made sense to his survival instincts and oft unclashed with by the book's argents. During training, he even went AWL, slipping away back to Pittsburgh only to be hunted down by city police. He was a rebel through and through, but commanders knew that his street violence would be an asset later. The reality of war finally smashed into Kelly in the summer of 1943 as he boarded a ship. The 36th Infantry Division boarded cramped troop transports and crossed the ocean to the sea. There they were briefed on Operation Avalanche, which was a massive amphibious assault on Salerno in Italy. On September 9th, the ramps dropped and the Americans charged into a meat grinder of machine gun fire. Through dense minefields and over the bodies of friends, the 36th Division pushed deep inland. After 4 days of relentless combat, Company finally reached the outskirts of Altavilla in September. The town sat on rugged mountainous terrain, nearly 1,000 feet above the level of the blue sea. To the east lay Hill 420, for a vital high ground the Americans had to hold tightly. The morning of September 13th dawned gray and lethal as L Company set up defensive positions. Kelly, serving as the squad automatic rifleman, hefted his 19-pound BAR and settled behind a wall. Suddenly, the terrifying canvas-ripping screech of an M1 gun shattered the morning air. Firing at a blistering 1,200 rounds per minute, the German gunners pinned the men to the dirt. Knowing that hesitation meant death, Kelly volunteered to take out the enemy machine gun nest alone. Leaving the safety of the line, he crawled on his belly through the rubble and craters in the street. Operating on pure instinct, he managed to flank the position, closing the distance to 60 yards now. Resting the heavy barrel of his BAR on a piece of masonry, he did not spray wildly at the Germans. Instead, he fired with surgical precision as shortened, controlled bursts echoed out in the dusty air. With the suppression lifted, American riflemen surged forward with a battle cry and overran the nest. But the Germans were seasoned professionals, and soon another machine gun opened up from a flank. As Kelly maneuvered to engage, he found himself trapped in a vicious crossfire from multiple directions. The two soldiers sent to cover him were forced to fall back, leaving Kelly completely isolated now. But the street brawler did not panic. As he pressed his face into the dirt and slowed his breathing. He waited for the exact moment the German gunner shifted his fire to track the retreating men. In that fraction of a second, Kelly surged upwards, and his BAR roared to life with lethal energy. A perfectly aimed burst tore the gunner apart, neutralizing the second major threat of the morning. By the afternoon, L Company was bleeding out and running critically low on all their ammunition. Kelly was ordered back to a 3-story olive oil warehouse on the edge of town for supplies. But the moment he arrived, all hell broke loose as 200 infantrymen launched an attack. Approximately 200 men from the 16th Panzer Division surged toward the warehouse. Inside there were fewer than 20 American personnel, mostly clerks and cooks with light arms. He hastily stacked heavy wooden crates to form a barricade, rested his BAR, and opened the gates of hell in the warehouse. As the gray uniforms flooded the open ground, the BAR roared in sustained bursts against the attacking infantry company. He mowed down the leading edge of the German assault, sweeping the gun left and right, dropping enemies like sifty wheat. Throughout the long and grueling afternoon and into the twilight, the Germans held every tactical advantage in the town. They hammered the building with mortars and small arms, but every time they tried to rush the gap, the fire drove them back. When night finally fell, the situation turned from desperate to a complete nightmare, and the ammunition was almost gone. The young soldier refused to abandon his post at the rear door, standing alone against the encroaching darkness of Italy. Plunged into absolute darkness, he fought entirely by sound and instinct, listening for the faint crunch of boots on gravel. He had not eaten or drunk anything in over 12 hours, his body pushing past the limits of human endurance in the siege. In the pitch black, he gauged how many rounds he had left simply by feeling the weight of the steel magazines in his hands. He rationed every single bullet, firing only when he was certain of a kill, dragging through an 18-hour nocturnal siege. At 7:20 in the morning, on September 14th, the Germans launched a brutal pincer movement to crush the warehouse. Knowing the ground floor was compromised, he sprinted up the stairs to a new position at a second-story window in the dark. He waited with terrifying patience as the German skirmish line crept closer to his location, 50 yards, 40 yards away. Then he opened fire, his short bursts devastating the attackers and stalling the momentum of the infantry charge in Italy. But then came 8:04 in the morning, and the disaster struck when the primary automatic weapon finally failed him. The heat expansion of the metal locked the bolt tight, rendering his only automatic weapon completely dead in the warehouse. Below him, dozens of German soldiers were regrouping in the street, preparing to storm the building with overwhelming force. Kelly spotted the crates of 60mm mortar shells that had been stockpiled in the room during the long siege. He did not have a mortar tube, but he did not care. He grabbed the high explosive shells with his bare hands to fight back. He did not throw them like grenades, he lobbed them like deadly baseballs, calculating the 40-yard drop in his head now. When the iron noses struck the hard cobblestones, the high explosive detonated with earth-shattering force in the street. The shockwaves and jagged shrapnel tore through the German ranks, blowing men to pieces and creating absolute chaos below. He threw shell after shell, maintaining a terrifying barrage of hand-tossed artillery on the street against the infantry. When he ran out of shells, his madness only escalated in the middle of the intense combat inside the ruined building. He found a bazooka lying in the rubble, a weapon that fired a shaped charge meant for enemy tanks in the open battlefield. Firing it from inside a small enclosed room was effectively a death sentence due to the lethal back blast of the weapon. But he hoisted the tube onto his shoulder, aimed at a machine gun nest down the street, and pulled the lethal trigger now. The rocket screamed out the window, obliterating the target as the back blast washed over the entire room in a flash of fire. Miraculously, it deflected off the walls in a way that left the American soldier entirely unscathed in the explosion. With the bazooka empty, he picked up an M1 Garand, emptying the 8-round clip into the enemy infantry in the street. Then he grabbed a Thompson submachine gun, spraying rounds down the stairwell to repel the enemy boarders from below. When every long gun in the building was empty, he drew his pistol and continued firing out the window at the great-eyed. The relentless one-man war raged until 10:15 in the morning, when the American reinforcements finally arrived in Italy. The surviving Germans broke and fled as a soot-covered officer found him exhausted and surrounded by empty weapons now. The officer looked out the window and stared in disbelief at the absolute carnage on the cobblestone street below him. Scattered across the street were exactly 40 dead German soldiers from the intense defense of the olive oil warehouse. At least 5 of them had been blown apart by the 60mm mortar shells he had thrown by hand from the window. The rest had been methodically hunted down by his accurate rifle and steady pistol fire throughout the long morning battle. One man had held a critical supply point against an assault for 18 straight hours alone during the entire siege. When the smoke cleared, Kelly's superiors realized that while he had violated countless safety protocols and tactical manuals, his actions were immediately forwarded up the chain of command, and he was recommended for the nation's highest decoration. On February 18, 1944, Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark personally draped the Medal of Honor in Italy. The military quickly rotated him back to the United States after he became the first soldier to earn the medal in Italy. The former street punk returned to Pittsburgh as a national M1 Garand parade was held in his honor for the public. The mayor handed him the key to the city, and tens of thousands of citizens lined the streets, showering him with cheers. Yet standing in the back of that open car, Kelly felt deeply uncomfortable with the sudden fame and the title of a hero. He rejected the title of hero, telling reporters with blunt honesty that he just did what he had to do to stay alive there. He served the rest of the war as an instructor at Fort Benning, teaching new recruits the brutal realities of urban combat. On January 11, 1985, at 64, Charles Ely passed away in a veterans' hospital from failure. Today, the olive oil warehouse is gone, swallowed by post-war reconstruction, and no grand monument marks the battle spot. The Medal of Honor ensures that history will never forget the day a rebellious gangster from the Rust Belt proved his grit. If you want to see more stories of incredible bravery and true grit on the battlefield, then like and subscribe to us now. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield as we explore the greatest legends of history.